Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talkback. I'm very excited about today's show. I have the author on the split screen with me, Lisa Brahin, who wrote a fabulous book, Tears Over Russia, A Search for Family and the Legacy of Ukraine's Pogroms. Why am I so excited? Well, a bunch of reasons. Today is April 18th, 2023. It's 100 years since Lisa's grandmother and my mother, got on a ship, or were in a ship coming to the United States of America from the Ukraine. Another reason it's exciting is this week we celebrate Yom HaShoah. We celebrate the Holocaust. Tomorrow is we commemorate. We don't celebrate, we commemorate it, and we remember what happened so it will never happen again. And tomorrow, April 19th, is the anniversary of the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto, which took the lives of many brave and courageous Jews. Why is this all connected? Because through our history, Lisa is a genealogist, an author. She studied her family's history and learned about their roots. We know that the Jewish people have gone through waves of pogroms over the thousands of years of existence since the beginning of the Torah in Exodus. And so we're celebrating our family's flight from the Ukraine, but we're celebrating, commemorating all the Jews' flight from peril, from disaster, from the genocide over the years. So today's, Lisa, is a perfect day to talk about your book and our connection, right?
Right. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Okay, so before we get into more of the details, I have to tell people about your background, okay? So you are an accomplished Jewish genealogist and a researcher. You're in New Jersey now in your home. I'm in Norwich, Connecticut in the Comcast Studios Zoom feature. You graduated from George Washington University's Columbian College, and you work coordinating under the jewishgen.org's Yiska Book Project, which is a project about the various towns in the Eastern European region who wrote stories about the towns that went through the Holocaust and their histories. They wrote them mostly in Yiddish, and you're helping to translate them and work on them. It's the Holocaust Memorial Book Project. And you wrote the book after years of studying about your grandmother's flight and your grandmother's family and their life in Ukraine. And you want to shine a light on a very important period in Jewish history. Tell us about what that period is right now.
Well, actually, it is a prelude 20 years before the Holocaust in Europe. My grandmother lived in what is now Ukraine. And from 1917 to 1921, there was a very deadly wave of pogroms. They're anti-Jewish massacres. I actually believe it was a genocide. It was between 100,000 and 250,000 Jews were murdered. So when my grandmother told me, I was a young girl, I was the same age as she was when she told me in her stories. I was a little girl, she was a little girl in the story she told me. And basically, I went, she told me them during bedtime stories, and I went with my mother to the library, and I couldn't find any other family stories. And as I grew up, I really found very little information. There were, some committees that put out reports, but I didn't find any family stories. Maybe they were there, but I wasn't able to locate them. So it was important to me as I was growing up, and during, it's almost 100 years since the pogroms that I write about, I decided that I was going to write her story. And this is how it all came about, Sheila. This was a time period really leading up to the Holocaust.
Right. And I think, as I've learned through your book and through other books, we know that this period between 1917 to 1921, when the Russian Revolution was going on and the Civil War, and the Jews were caught with so many different pogroms. By the way, pogroms, it's not programs, it's pogroms. They are devastating actions of death, destruction of property, raping of women, just terror. onto the Jewish communities in the Russian Empire at that time. And so many of us are not aware of that period, as you are, and now I am learning, because the Holocaust in the 40s overshadowed that. Isn't that right? And people think of that. And we know that there were pogroms in the Russian Empire, because we know that between 1880 and 1924, many of our ancestors did come. And there were always waves of pogroms. But the time period that you write about, Lisa, for your grandmother, for my grandmother and my mother, was as devastating as a prelude to what would follow another 20 years, right?
Absolutely. I wish there was more. It's understandable, of course, that the Holocaust was such a big and tragic event that most of the information written about it and the light shined on it, to study and educate ourselves. But I wish that there was more out prior, that was actually published prior to the Holocaust, about my grandmother's time period, because it really was a warning that bad things were to come. And I'm glad, though, that I finally got the story out, and that people are starting to learn about that. The Holocaust just didn't happen. There were other events that happened leading up to it.
Okay, so this is a great period of time, because your book is part of I think, the explosion in our interest in Jewish genealogy and genealogy for all peoples. So this story resonates. So you don't have to be Jewish to appreciate the story, to appreciate the peril, the flight to America, as so many of our ancestors in America did. So let me tell everybody how I found you, which is
that's the best part.
thing. That's the best part. So before we go into the details of your book, your story, which turned out to be my story. So I read about this book written by this author from New Jersey, Lisa Brahin, all about the shtetl Stavisht in the Ukraine between the years of like 1917, 1923. And I said, oh my God, that's the same shtetl my mother was born in 1916. She was 5 years old in 1921 when she fled south with her grandmother, not my grandmother, her mother's sister, her Aunt Ruth. They fled down to the river Dniester, which separated Ukraine and Romania at the time. And they had to stay in Romania for 2 years after that perilous journey, before in 1923 they could get on a ship to come to America, the same ship that some of Lisa's family also came on. You'll see that. Well, when I read this, my mind was just blown, because I've been writing about my mother's history. She had told some of the stories, but she was a little girl when she left Russia. My grandmother didn't like to talk about it very much, my bubby, as I called her, because she said we were strangers in a strange land in Ukraine, in Russia. In the Russian Empire. They did not welcome us. They tried to kill us for all those years. Why should I be interested in talking about it, reliving it? It's too painful. And so I had to learn on my own, but my mother did. We did record some of her memories of crossing that river, which we'll talk about, about 200 miles of travel. Can you imagine the courage it took to do that? Anyway, I saw the book online and I said, I have to get the book. I have to find this author and talk to her. And I had no idea what Lisa's cell phone number was. I didn't even have her email address, but I went on Free White Pages in New Jersey on the computer, and I found this landline on her name. And I called it, and this woman answered, and she said, why are you calling me on my landline that nobody uses? And I said, are you Lisa Brahin? And that's how it started. And now that was a wonderful relationship beginning. About the book. So I'm so thrilled to share that history and to share Lisa with all of you. We're going to go through some of the history and some of the photographs in a program of slides that will really give you the story. Okay. Anything you want to say before we start the slideshow?
I'm just so thrilled you found me, because I feel like finally, September 1st of this year, it's 100 years for our families. I think we're reconnecting our families after a century, because I'm sure we knew each other. Our families knew each other.
Yeah, so Yeah, we'll get into talking a little bit more about that. So let me go to the PowerPoint and start it. Can
Okay.
you see that?
Not yet. Oh, it's coming on. There it is. Okay.
Okay, Tears Over Russia, A Search for Family and the Legacy of Ukraine's Pogroms, a wonderful book. It reads, Lisa, almost like a novel, but it is based in history and it has many footnotes and authorities that you quote in the book. So it's a wonderful combination of a terrific story and history.
Thank
And
you.
I know you were probably very careful in your footnoting and your
Yes.
research, right? Yeah.
Yes. It's a work of
Okay.
nonfiction, and you'll see there's like 1,000 footnotes in the book.
Okay. Now, we just like to start with the maps because we want people to get an idea of what the Russian Empire and what the Pale of Settlement looked like. What is the Pale of Settlement? Well, it's very interesting. In 1791, they had Catherine the Great was a leader of the Russian Empire. And, Jews were always expelled from one place and shifted to another. And, all through the Jewish diaspora, which really is the journey of Jews throughout the world, every time they went from one place to another, right? She decreed that the Jews could only live in certain areas in the Russian Empire. And with very few exceptions, they were forbidden from even living in the cities. So naturally, they were forced to move to small towns. And we call them shtetls, which is the Yiddish or Jewish word for a small town. And so here is a map that shows in that pale green the Pale of Settlement. What were the countries that exist now that make that up? Well, it was mostly the Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, and parts of Poland. Those were the 4 countries we know of today where our ancestors lived. That was the Pale of Settlement. In 1917, it ended when the Russian Revolution started. You had the Civil War. Russia was in turmoil and didn't really settle into the communist government until about 1922. So that's the Pale. And you can see in the Pale of Russia, can you see Kiev? Where is Kiev in there?
Yes, it's right in the
Oh,
center
here it is,
there. There it
right in
is.
the center where
Right.
I'm pointing, right in the red
Mhm.
dot. And then we go, you can see the river Dniester, which we'll talk about later, which
Mhm.
is the separation between the Ukraine and Romania. And there's this town of Kishinev, which we'll
Mhm.
get to also where they wound up. So now
Right.
let's turn to the next map. What's so interesting about this map, Lisa?
Okay, well, we see Kiev again. It's yeah, the pointer's going to that. Excuse me. Just beneath that, you see Belitserka, and there's a lot of the chapters in my book revolve around that shtetl, or it was actually a bigger town because all the Jews fled there from Stavish. They thought it was a little bit safer. You go further south, and we have Kishinev that we discussed, the Dniester River, which
Well, here's
separated.
the Dniester.
Yes,
Oh,
that's
it's,
it.
it's what says Chisinau is really Kishinev now.
Right. That's how my grandmother and her cousins pronounced it. If you go further south of there, and I think we have Bucharest. Some of the Jews made a stop over there. But if you maybe pull up the map just a little bit, oh, there's Constanza
Yeah,
right
yeah,
there by the water there. That was where the port was, where a lot of Ukrainian Jews left Europe. So Sheila, this was the last stop for your family and my family leaving Europe. That's where we sailed out of, and
right,
where
right.
many
Well,
people with our similar background, their
right. Oh,
ancestors fled.
and we have, you have, I have the passport documents, the
Right.
immigration documents. They're in Bucharest because that was the
Mhm.
capital of Romania, and
Right.
then of course the port of Constanza where they sailed from. So all of this map shows that. Of course, Stavish was a very small shtetl, so it was
Mhm.
not on this map. But we have another map where I think we have Stavish.
Yes.
Here it is
Okay.
down here.
It's down there. So it's just above Zashkov. Zashkov's at the very bottom. That was a really tiny shtetl. And I mentioned that because Moshe Dayan's family was from Zashkov, and they were related to the rabbi of Stavisht. So
Uh
right
huh.
above it, you see Stavisht. That's the town that I write about. All the way on the top, you see Kiev, and then we see Boyarka. So if you go to the left,
Yeah,
yes,
here it
right
is.
there.
Yeah.
Boyarka is what the shtetl, it's the real life shtetl that Sholem Aleichem modeled Anatevka on.
Oh,
So
that is interesting.
many
Yeah.
of us who've watched Fiddler on the Roof, that's what it was modeled on. And Stavisht was fairly close, as you can see on this map. This is a blown up map. Um,
Well, I think how far, many miles was Stavish from Kiev
okay, it was
approximately?
about 78 miles south. So we're
Okay.
looking at maybe, less than 80 miles of this
And
whole.
Belaya Tserkov
That's
was,
30 miles north. So when they
uh,
fled, they were running on foot, or horse and wagon about 30 miles north, almost just a little bit under 30
right. And
miles.
you're going to show later that when conditions was very bad in Stavish and there was a
Yes.
lot of fear, they went either by foot or horseback to Belaya Tserkov.
Right,
Right?
right.
Yeah.
And then on the
Okay.
bottom there, you see to the bottom left of Stavisht, south, right, you see Tetiev. So
Yes.
when my family fled, they had gone up to Belitserka and then they were fleeing. They went south again. They went through Tetiev, and very little is known about Tetiev, but I believe it was one of the biggest massacres against the Jews during this time period. I think about at least 4,000 Jews were murdered in a very short period of time in that shtetl. And I mention it because my family rode through there and they saw, it was months later after the big massacre, but they saw what remained, which was pretty devastating, especially for the children to see that.
Right. And this is just it's not a great photograph clarity wise, but it shows you what I call the shtetl architecture, because this is how many of the homes look and were built. And the interesting thing is that the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, which is a wonderful place for the study of the Yiddish language and culture and bringing millions of books back that could have been destroyed or not kept by the younger generations. They built their beautiful center using some of this shtetl architecture design. So that's why I show that. It's important, I think. Let's see the next one. Tell us about what makes this picture interesting.
Well, if you look at the sign, that was either a shoemaker or a bootmaker. This was in Stavisht. This was taken about 1890. Now, my great grandfather was a shoemaker in Stavisht, but this was only around the time of his birth. So it was a Jewish shop though. And I love the pictures of the boots up there. But
Yeah,
this is very typical of what Stavisht
right,
looked like.
right. And you can
By
see
the
that
way, it hangs in there's a little museum in Stavish, Sheila, and this picture hangs in that museum.
Well, have you ever been there,
I have
Lisa?
not. I
Well,
wanted to go with my grandmother when she was still living, but let me tell you, she had so many anxieties and fears about going back after what
oh,
she went through. She didn't want to go, and so I never went. But somebody I know who lives in Stavisht told me this was in the museum.
well, Lisa, we have to organize a group of descendants of Stavisht, perhaps our children and their children, whatever. Get a group together and plan a trip,
Okay.
or
I'll leave that up to you, Sheila.
or a virtual trip online.
Oh,
Speaking, can we do that with one of the people that you know in
well, I
Stavisht?
happen to know
Yeah,
a gentleman who's the YouTuber in Stavish. I'll ask him.
that would be great.
He knows
Okay,
all about the history of Stavish. He's very interested.
yeah, we'll work on that.
Okay.
Here's another picture that is Stavish. Do you know about
Yes.
when it is?
Yes, this is 1923. So this is right after we see the devastation of the pogroms, and the people left there took this photograph. I believe those two buildings are most likely synagogues. They were former synagogues. In Stavish, there were originally 6, and 3 were burned, and 3 remained. I believe these two buildings are what they look like after the fact. So some Jews, there were a few hundred Jews, who did not leave the country. And when they
Mhm.
went back after the pogroms, they actually lived in the synagogues. They cordoned
Wow.
off, there were 10, 12 families living in each of them, because when they came back after everything was said and done, either their homes were torched or destroyed, or there were peasants took over their homes. They didn't have any place to live. So the JDC sent to the JDC Bureau in New York City these photographs. There were three of them, three photographs asking for financial help. And this is where this photo came about.
Oh, interesting. Just to clarify for people watching, sometimes we say stavisht with a T, but sometimes you see it written Stavische without a T, right? So
Right.
we can,
The Jews tend to say stavisht, like there's a
right,
T. Even my grandmother would, I think in Yiddish, stavishta.
right,
And of course, it's stavish. All different ways they say it.
right. I've heard stavish too, like
Ukrainian,
growing up.
Russian, all different
Right, right.
pronunciations.
Okay. And in terms of population, Stavish had about how many Jews in that period between 1917 and 23?
Well, there were 8,500 residents, and about half of the population was Jewish. They sort of formed a little bit of a ghetto, sort of in the center of the town, and the peasants lived on the outskirts, mostly on farms.
Right. Because Jews really were not allowed to own land. So they
No, they
tended
weren't.
more to be the shopkeepers, the small traders, and things like that.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Now here we come to the feature, your book.
Okay.
Tell us about that.
Well, this is the cover of my book. You'll notice that there's two countries in the title, both Russia and Ukraine, and it seems to be a little bit confusing to some of my friends who constantly ask me about it. And what I say to them is that when my grandmother was born, she was born in 1912, Stavist was a part of the Russian Empire. So to her, she was born in Russia, but by her early childhood, by the time the pogroms came around, it was then Ukraine. So the borders kept changing. So it's very hard, I think, when you're doing research, when you're a genealogist, or you just want to learn about your family
Right.
history. A lot of people say to me, well, how do I know what country I'm supposed to be researching? But that's very common in this part of Europe with the borders changing. And in my book, just a concentrated certain few years right there. Every time I go to a new chapter, it was a different country, back and
Yeah.
forth.
Absolutely, because Ukraine was independent for a short period of time. And
Hmm.
of course, it really has always, in a way, been under the umbrella, whether it's the Russian Empire, and then, of
Right,
course, the Soviet Union. Then, with the
right.
breakup of the Soviet Union, it became independent. And now, of course, we have what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's
Very,
unfortunate.
very sad.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's,
so Stavish today is Ukraine because, of course, as I said, it's just about a little under 80 miles south of Kiev.
right, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Who's this?
Well, this is the most important photograph in my Jewish genealogical journey. The little baby in this photograph is my grandmother Hannah. In America, we called her Anne. And standing next to her is my beautiful ancestor. Her name, my great grandmother, her name was Rebecca Cutler Caprow. This was taken in Stavisht. And since she was born in the latter part of 1912, I think that's probably when it was taken. She used to tell me bedtime stories. I was a little girl visiting her. She never told my mother, who's her daughter. I think it was very painful, too soon, too close to what she experienced. But by the time I came around and I couldn't sleep, the only stories I really had any interest in were stories that she drew from her own youth. So they lived in Stavish during the pogroms, 1917 to 1921, and they endured what we had just earlier discussed, these horrible pogroms. And basically, if you take a close look at the photograph, you might be able to see there's water damage on it. There's some white circular dots. And that water damage was from when it fell. My family fled. You mentioned the Dniester River, which was a good 200 miles away, and they were piled up in a rowboat. They're going into Romania illegally, and they were doing it while the border guards were changing. But if they were caught, they were going to be shot at. So they row out into the middle of the Dniester, Sheila, and water starts coming in, and the boat's sinking. And they all fell out of the boat. They're in the middle of the Dniester. It's October, November, it's pretty cold out. Luckily, the adults could stand and they lifted the children up, but the pictures and all of their belongings, they tumbled into the Dniester River. And this was one of the things that fell. Now, I have no idea how many photos were lost, but they were fishing their things out while trying not to be shot at, or detected. And this is one of the photographs that they were able to save, which is
Wow.
why it's really so dear to me. But you can see the damage. Now,
Right.
I knew my great grandmother, Rebecca. She passed away when I was 9 years old, and I used to go visit her. And she had this particular photograph. This is the only thing that interested me in her apartment. She had this photograph propped up on a shelf, and I used to stare at it. And this photo, Sheila, I think it ignited something in me, a lifetime desire. I wanted to learn every detail of their past, because if you
Mm,
look at this photograph, you can see another world. It was my proof another world preceded mine, and I was
right.
determined to discover what it was. So the adults in the room, my mother and her cousin, they're cleaning out her apartment. She died in July of 1972 when I was a little girl. And while they're busy with looking at things in a closet, I swiped this photograph off of the shelf and I kind of stole it. I decided I was going to have it, and I wasn't going to let anyone else have it. And it stayed in my bedroom in a frame for a good 50 years. And now 50 years later, since she died in 1972, this particular photograph is what graces the cover of my book.
Wow. Well, that's fantastic. And the story of the river, of the boat sinking, of
Mhm.
the people on the other side trying to discover you and shoot at you. I mean, it couldn't be more important and more exciting. And to have this photo is magnificent. I don't
Mhm.
have any pictures.
Oh,
I don't know. It's amazing that your family was able to take a series of photographs when they left. My mother gave me the impression that all they could do was grab a bread, bake a bread, and inside the bread put
mhm.
whatever money, maybe a few jewels of some of their valuable possessions. She remembers having that sack around her middle, right,
Yes,
with the bread
that's
in
what
it,
they did.
and that she remembers as a little girl, as a 5 or 6 year old girl, and but to have other possessions like your family collected, would they have any pots and pans? I mean, what else did they bring on
No,
those
but I will tell
photos?
you one thing they have. They have, there were three pieces, a silver shot glasses. Um,
Wow.
and
Hmm.
it had a design on it, and it also matched a wedding band that my great grandmother
Right.
wore.
Well, you would use those shot glasses for schnapps or,
Right.
liquor
Maybe vodka. I don't
to
know.
make a blessing and
Right.
have a drink to make a
And they
blessing.
were actually toasting some friends out before a pogrom. They were using these, it's in my book, they were using these silver shot glasses. But I have
So
one.
that,
I think my mother has one,
yeah.
and I think a cousin has another one.
Yeah, but I don't have any artifacts, only the memories that I learned from my mother as a little girl.
Mhm.
Okay, that's fabulous. Oh, here we
Okay.
go. Yeah,
So as you can see, this is another photograph of Rebecca and Hannah. And it's taken a few years later because you see Hannah's a little bit older. But I have to tell you, this photograph didn't look like this when I received it. My grandmother kept it in an old photo album, but it was really in bad shape. This one went into the Dniester River too, and it was almost like too embarrassing to show it. It was in really bad shape. And I met a genealogist who was an expert in restoring photography. And I sent it to him, and he restored it. And then on top of it, he colorized it. And wow, it became a beautiful photograph. And now we can see just how beautiful they were. Rebecca was a seamstress in Stavist, and she made their dresses. And Hannah is wearing a lace dress, and her
yeah,
mother's collar, you can see, matches it.
yeah,
And
beautiful.
this is before she didn't even meet her father yet. Her father was away in the army. So it's just the two of them, and I just love this photograph now. I'm
Well,
glad we were able
Lisa,
to restore.
it almost looks like a painting. It could be a painting in
Yeah,
a particular school of art. Really, it is
yeah,
beautiful.
it's
Okay.
lovely. So this is my great grandfather. His name was Isaac Caprove, and he is Hannah's father and Rebecca's husband. And he's pictured here. He was a soldier in the Tsar's army, so it was still Russia in circa 1912, and he got caught up in World War One. So he didn't know Hannah was born until after he came home.
Wow.
What was interesting about this was several years ago, before the war with Russia and Ukraine, there was a website up in Russia. And if you had an ancestor who was either killed as a soldier in the Tsar's army during World War One, or if he was wounded with discharge papers, there were documents. There were a lot of documents. And Isaac was wounded, and I was able to find these documents. Everything's in Russian, though, so I had to depend on a Russian researcher to find them. And it confirmed my grandmother's story. They sent the men from Ukraine, from Stavish, all the way to Siberia. That's a long ride. She used to say
Yeah.
it was like 40 days and nights by train. I'm not sure, but that's what she used to say. But it does confirm he was stationed right by the Amur River, which was 19 miles, I think, from China. That's how far away in
Wow.
Siberia he was, and he could literally stand by the river and see the shores of China.
Wow. Well, so many young Jewish boys from the age of 13, 14 were
Mhm.
conscripted, drafted into the Russian army,
That's
and
true.
many of them almost for life. It was very hard to get out.
Yes,
There were lots of things that they tried to do to escape, one of them being just to escape Russia altogether, try to flee. So
absolutely.
that was a great
Unfortunately, a
gift.
lot of them also tried to mutilate themselves, and probably a lot of people hear those kind of stories to get out of the army.
I heard that story
Yeah.
that my one of my great aunts, one of my grandmother's sisters' husband cut off a toe, a foot, or
Oh,
something like that. Yeah, in order to not be able to go into the army.
no. Okay, so this is a photograph. You see, it's Isaac Kaprov again, my great grandfather on the right. He's the taller gentleman, looking very dapper there. I often wondered if that might have been taken on his wedding day, because look, he's wearing, it looks like a shirt and maybe a tie under
Mm,
there and a nice big hat. So he came home. He was discharged during World War One, and he went back to Stavisht, where he opened up a shoe shop, a boot. I called him a boot maker. He had a one room. He actually made the boots right there, and there was a big display window. And the family lived in the rooms behind the shoe shop. So one night, he was doing fairly well financially and everything. And one night in 1919, in June, he and Rebecca, his wife, were out in the back courtyard by the Stavishta Inn. They were using those shot glasses I just spoke about, celebrating the marriage of a neighbor, a couple they were friendly with. And a pogrom came about. They had no warning at all. They could hear horrible screams. They were right there in the courtyard with them. And my great grandmother, um, they knew that they left the children were actually asleep in one of the back rooms. They were sharing a bed. They were 3 and 6 years old, Hannah and her little sister, Sunny. And they were afraid that they couldn't get back to save them. And my great grandmother says to my great grandfather, if we go and we run to the house now, they're going to follow us. They can see us. We're in their sight line, and they're going to kill all of us. It's like leading them to the children. So they hid in a root cellar behind the Stavishta Inn. And can you imagine, Sheila? They spent an entire evening worried about their children, and you could hear what was going on. Zhelezhnik, who was under Grigoriev, the White Guards, his group was raiding Stavish. They were killing Jews. And the local bandits, the local peasants joined them. And this often happened
yeah.
on the raids. And they had axes and hammers, whatever whatever they were holding. They were bats, anything. They were smashing windows, um, and they were killing people. They were raping women, and they were listening to this the whole night. And they couldn't get back to save them. The morning came around. They came out of the root cellar. They ran to the house to check on the children, and they were shocked. There was nothing disturbed within the house. The window was still intact. The door was still intact. And the girls were fine. They had been sleeping and they woke
Right.
up, and it was
Right.
almost as if the house was passed over, that Passover story. So
Right. Well,
what happened? Yeah,
yeah. I was just going
very,
to say, I
go
just
ahead.
was going to say that you gave away a wonderful suspense story in your book, because that episode where the children were hidden and the parents were overnight and couldn't get to them. That's at the beginning of your book, and it's
Right.
very suspenseful, and you really get the flavor for the fear and the terror that is going on with these pogroms. I wanted to,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Discovered, Sheila, that the head bandit of the local bandits, the local peasants, his name was Vasil. He actually worked for Isaac. Isaac had been very kind to him. His daughter he had a little girl Hannah's age, and his daughter was starving. And he was very good to Vasil and his daughter, and he gave Vasil a job. He thought, in his mind, Isaac felt every man had the right to work hard and provide, food for their family. So he taught Vasil how to be a shoemaker. And when the raids were coming down, Vasil was one of the leaders against the Jews. They were bashing in the windows, and he stopped everybody. And he said, "You're not going in this house. This is where I work. This man was very good to me. We're going to go and kill some other Jews." And they passed over the house, literally, where my grandmother and her sister were really alone in the house.
wow.
And that's how they survived. But that's a story that really always resonates and stays with me, because I wonder, because of this incident and how they were saved, it's why I'm here today.
Well, and you keep going further month to month from there, just crossing that river and not getting arrested and being sent back or being shot. There's so many periods where they were lucky, where they got some kind of pass over of the danger, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the next photograph, and this is a Hebrew list. For those of us who can read Hebrew, we read from right to left. So you see, it looks like a list of names, and then
Right.
it's followed by the ages of people on
Right.
this list. So
52, 30, 30, 55. Yes,
yeah, I think
exactly.
there might be a really young, I don't know if this is
11,
one,
11-year
yeah, a
old.
child, a
Yeah.
young boy. So this is a death list. I call it, often in Yisker books. And by the way, I'm involved in two towns of the Yisker book project. Not the whole project. I don't run it, but I do head up two towns. And I grew up knowing what Yisker books look like. And in the back, they call them tombstone lists.
Mhm.
And you see the names of the people that were murdered. And so this one was called Megillah HaTiva by Eliezer David Rosenthal. So where did I find this list? Because and who is on this list? This is a list of the people that were murdered that night when my grandmother and her sister
Oh,
survived in her bed in Stavisht in June of 1919. They lived. Many of these people lived on her street or neighboring streets. There were actually 30 murders that night. This is a list that contains 19 names of, I guess, witnesses that had this recorded. So that's rather shocking to find this, but how did I find this? Well, I had heard, this is going back to 2003, I had heard that another gentleman a few years earlier had stumbled upon it in an Israeli archive. And he was looking at it, then he put it back, and they couldn't quite remember where it was located, and it sat a few years. And then I'm looking for any kind of pogrom lists and pogrom informations, and somebody told me so and so saw this list. So I headed up a search for it. I had a couple of archivists from my computer in Israel searching for. It's from a large manuscript by Eliezer Rosenthal. So they searched for it. We thought it was in Gymnasium archives, and they couldn't find it. And then, no, they kept on, they interviewed the man who saw it. And a few months later, took an entire summer, and they finally found the manuscript. And I was interested in it because I was looking for pages on Stavisht. It had many different towns in it. And well, then I hear from them, yes, we found it, but guess what? It's falling apart and you can't see it. They can't give me the pages that I need because it needed an entire restoration project. So they felt that it was important enough where the National Library of Israel had a restoration project. It took almost a year. And then finally, after it was restored, I received the pages. And this is one of the pages on Stavisht. So an interesting fact about that, about this manuscript, Emma Goldman. So we all know who Emma Goldman was. She was this anarchist who was deported from the United States in 1919. This is when this particular list was written. She ended up in Odessa. She called it Russia. She said she was deported to Russia, but by then it was kind of already Ukraine. And she meets Chaim Bialik, who is an Israeli poet and writer, very well known. And she writes in her memoir that she wrote in the early 1920s, she also met a man who she called, quote unquote, a literary investigator, who was a friend of Bialik's. And he was collecting all of these papers and lists and testimonies on 70 something cities of where the Jews were murdered during the pogroms in this area of Ukraine. So I thought that was really interesting. When I was reading her memoir, she doesn't mention Rosenthal by name, but she mentions Bialik. And I figured it out. I said, this is definitely, she's talking about, she knew that there was somebody compiling a work on the pogroms, but what happened to it? So part of the manuscript, the first part of the alphabet, was published in Israel. They smuggled the manuscript out of Ukraine. And it was a very large manuscript. They didn't get to the whole manuscript. Now, Stavisht was on the part that was not yet published. And then in the early 1930s, we have Bialik and Rosenthal both like died within a year of each other. And there was nobody left to see to the rest of the manuscript being published. And Rosenthal had 2 grandsons, and they didn't know what to do with the manuscript. And eventually, they donated it to an archive in Israel, and this is at Genezim. And nobody looked at it until this gentleman that I spoke about earlier saw it. Maybe it sat 70 years. He found it in a brown envelope. And he was like amazed. He says the writing is beautiful. He could read the Hebrew. He was really amazed by it. But when I heard that, I mean, nobody had looked at it since he saw it. And then we went for this search, and then I found it. So now it is restored, and it is at Genezim.
Wow. Isn't it true, Lisa, that when some of these Yiddish books were written after the Holocaust in the 40s, they gave lots of histories about what was going on in the shtetl, in Stavisht, and the other towns they were written for. Absolutely. And they would very often have death lists as well that they could recall. Names of victims who were murdered in the pogroms during not just the Holocaust, but during the earlier pogroms, like the 1917 period.
Well, that's how I sort of knew what this was. My grandfather had an uncle who was a Yizkor book writer. I came from a family that wrote a Yizkor book for another town. And I used to look at the Yiddish. I couldn't really read it. I could decipher the names. And I knew they were death lists. And most of the Yizkor books were on Holocaust victims. But there are some, as you said, for earlier time periods like this. So this was, I think, Eliezer Rosenthal meant for this to be a Yizkor book, a testimony of what happened, along with, there were many lists. But I was thrilled to find the one. This list, what happened, obviously, it's depicted in my book. A lot of the people whose names appear on this particular list, there's a translation, and it appears in my book. So this is, you might wonder why I'm using, it's such a blurry photograph, but this is a murder victim, Elik Stepansky. He was a blacksmith in Stavisht. And during General Denikin's raids, which was it was another pogrom. There were many pogroms in Stavisht. He was murdered, and three of Hannah's cousins, they were running around. They were little kids, and they looked through a window, and unfortunately, they were eyewitnesses to his murder. And he was a cousin of theirs. And later that night, his young son, he had an infant son, his brother, his younger brother, and his grandmother were all brutally murdered.
Oh.
And I found this photograph because I searched for his family. His widow and two children made it to Argentina. A lot of the Jews settled there. And I found his granddaughter, and this is all she had of her grandfather.
Wow.
And I wanted to honor him by using a photo in my book. And his story, the scene is depicted in my book. Unfortunately, the granddaughter passed away over the pandemic, but she would have been thrilled to see the book finally come out.
Like a nice memorial for him. Yeah.
So we're at the good part. This is a hero. We have a photograph of Rabbi Pitzi Avram from Stavisht. He's the gentleman with the white beard on the right. And he's seen here with his son Nissan and his wife Sarah. So just a side note about Nissan, he's the father of the great French scientist, because he ended up in France, Mosai Heisinski. His son was one of the founders of radiochemistry, which I think has something to do with MRI machines. He was also a lab partner of Marie Curie.
Wow.
So the rabbi was very brilliant, and a lot of his grandchildren became famous scientists. There was another one in California, unfortunately passed away a few years ago. His name was Max, a friend of mine, very dear friend. And so a lot of my information came from Max, actually. So he was a Rabbi Pitzi Avram, whose real name was Heisinski in Europe or Gaysinski in America. He was a brilliant, bright light in this story. He was a hero. And every time he believed like God looked after him, and in return, and he took this very seriously, he thought he was the protector of the Jews of Stavisht. But that was really a hard thing to do during the pogroms. So he was a brave and skilled negotiator. And every time there was a pogrom, there were at least 10 major pogroms that I found in Stavisht. He would throw himself out in harm's way, and his wife would just die watching him do this, because he wanted to be brought in front of the pogrom bandit leaders, and he wanted to negotiate for the safety of Stavisht Jews. And that's what he did. Every time there was a pogrom, and the bandits actually they actually admired him. They thought he was brave, and they've never seen anything like this before. He really put his life in danger by doing this.
But so he would collect stuff from the Jews, money, goods, things, and bribe them with that, and get them to not kill them. Not
absolutely. He collected the ransom. Basically, everything was a ransom. The looters wanted money. That's what they were really all about. And I just think that, there were 160 people were murdered over a course of several years in Jews, killed during the pogroms in Stavisht. And I know that's way too many, but compared to the other shtetls and towns, it really was a small amount in comparison.
Exactly.
And 4,000 Jews escaped to go to other lands, like Sheila, your family, and my family. They were saved because of this man's bravery. He stood up for us, and they admired him. So he also lived too. That didn't always happen. Unfortunately, they would often leave. These bandits would leave Stavisht and go on to the next town. And the first thing they did was go murder the rabbi and then commit mass murders in the town.
Right.
So, he was this brilliant, bright light and a very big hero in my story.
So Stavisht, in a sense, nothing we really should call luck. It was all a tragedy. But compared to other shtetls, because of Reverend Rabbi Pitzi Avram, the Jews fared better, and many were able to escape. Keeping in mind, however, that those several hundred who remained in Stavisht were devastated, destroyed, executed during the Nazi era, right?
They sure
that
were. There
happened.
were, I think about 300 or so. They were
Mhm.
murdered in the forest. It's in
Right.
an appendix in my book.
Right.
I
Right.
found that there was, I don't know if there were more. I only found one young girl who survived.
Right. But we also have the story of Fitzy Rum. He is buried in the same cemetery as my great aunt and uncle, Chava and Julius Smolensky, because they're buried in the Stavishta Benevolent Association section of the Montefiore Synagogue in Queens, New York. And I visited with my brother, our great aunt and uncle, some months before I met you and learned about your book, and didn't realize that Fitzy Avram's grave was practically right next door to
It was next to the gate.
next to
I
the gate.
think,
Well,
Sheila, you took a photograph, and part
I
of his
know.
gravestone was on your photograph.
Amazing. Well, now my brother and I have to go back
Yeah.
and look at. But the other tragic thing was that he first fled with his family to England, to London, and then he went to America and lived in the Bronx, had a synagogue there. And he died in the most awful way, considering his bravery and his fantastic life and what he did for the people of Stavish. He was crossing the street and got run over by a taxi. Now, how unbelievable is that?
It's shocking that this man who was so,
Yes, I know.
brilliant and I want to say powerful in a sense. I mean,
Yeah,
whether it be mentally powerful, whatever it is.
yeah.
I mean, he was a hero.
He was a hero because in so many of the stories in your book and what I'm reading in other books about this period, those bandits, they went into the synagogues. They raped women on top of the Torah, on the bima where you keep the most holy documents, or they had all the Jews in the town in that synagogue and then burned it down with everyone. I mean, just the stories are just unbelievable. And it doesn't matter whether it was 100,000 or 250,000, many more, maybe 1 million lives at least were impacted by
Right.
having to flee, by losing people to death, to devastation, destruction of property. I mean, you can't even just put it into the words, well, compared to the 6 million, there was only 200,000. That's not how you have to look at it.
No.
Every one of those lives was precious, and it was, and so many lives were ruined and impacted forever because of what happened.
Right. Very well said.
So,
I
yeah.
agree. This is a picture of the Stavish Torah crown, which I discovered with the assistance of Rabbi Pitzi Avram's grandson, Max, in the year 2005. It's in the Ark of a New Jersey synagogue. So how did it get there? During the pogroms in 1920, there were 6 synagogues I had mentioned earlier, and 3 of them were torched. And during that pogrom, Rabbi Pitzi Avram ran into one of the burning synagogues, and he opened the ark for the last time. And he took out the Torah from that particular Stavish synagogue, 2 Torah crowns. They adorn the Torah on top of the Torah.
Right.
I think there was also a breastplate. We were only able to find the 1 crown. So he carries them by hand during his daughter's out. Chava, that's Max's mother, she's out looking for her father, fearing that he was killed. And then all of a sudden she realized the synagogue was on fire, and she knew exactly where he was. He was at the ark. And she sees him coming out, and they all start to run. And as they're running, they pass another synagogue. And we could go on to the next. Yes. So in this other synagogue was Cantor David Yosel Moser of Stavisht. This photograph was taken around 1916. So the Chazan was reading his Torah, and the bandits burst in into this synagogue, and they start defiling the Torah, as you said. I don't want to get too explicit what they were doing. But they finally torched it right in front of him. They took it from him. And as he's watching what's going on, he has a heart attack, and he falls to the ground, and he dies. He's dying of a heart attack right beside the burning Torah in Stavisht.
Unbelievable.
And outside, Yeah.
It probably was not the only story like that. And I
No.
would have to correct, it's circa 1916, not
Right. It's a
36. I'll
typo.
correct that.
Yeah.
Yes, a typo.
But
But
Sheila, this all happened just as we have Rabbi Pitzi Avram and parts of his family, and he's holding one Torah from Stavish and these crowns, and he's running, he's fleeing for his life, and he has no idea that Cantor David Yosel is in this other synagogue he's passing, and he's dying. And the Torah
unbelievable.
there is burning. So it's very dramatic. And as you said, it probably happened in a lot of towns. We don't know about that. But a side note about Cantor David Yosel before we go on, he was the teacher of the first blind cantor in Stavish. He was one of the most famous blind cantors in Europe at that time. He was named Leaper the Blinder, the blind one.
The blind,
So Cantor David Yosel became very well known, and he was very popular in Stavish, and he
right.
does appear quite a bit in my book.
Okay, just to let everybody know, chazan is the word for cantor in Hebrew and Yiddish, chazan. Okay.
Okay, so this is obviously a house. It's Itzi Stumacher's house in Bella Cerca. So who was Itzi Stumacher? Well, my great-grandmother, Rebecca Cutler, had a sister named Molly Cutler, and she married Itzi Stumacher, and they lived in this house in Bella Cerca. It's a pretty nice house there. You can see there's two doors. They had a rental apartment attached to it. So every time there was a pogrom in Stavish, my family fled to Molly's house in Bella Cerca, and they stayed in that second doorway there. Unfortunately, my great-grandmother Rebecca had typhus while she was living there, and there was a third child born by then. Her name was Faye, and Faye died in that house. She starved to death while her mother had typhus. So the house had very sad memories, but I was thrilled that a cousin had like a photograph of this house.
Wow.
Still existed. I mean, it's amazing. I think one of her cousins, one of the little boys on the doorstep, is one of my grandmother's first cousins. But it's sad, but I wanted to show it because it's a great photograph.
It's a beautiful photograph. And now
So
Barney Stumacher.
this is Barney Stumacher, and he and his story. This is the wildest story in my entire book. Barney was a wild guy, and he did something. There was something inside this man that allowed him to do something incredible. So who was he? He was a cousin of Itzi Stumacher, whose house we just saw. And he had already immigrated to America about 10 years prior, and he served as in the U.S. Army during World War I. And he was living in America, and he receives in 1920, he receives a letter from his father, who was still living in Bella Cerca. The whole family, he had his parents and three sisters were still in Bella Cerca. And the letter, it's fascinating. It's in my book. And his father describes what's going on with the pogroms. I mean, eyewitness account. And he says, Barney, if you don't come and save us from all these pogroms, we're basically all going to perish. We're all going to die. So what does Barney do? What does a good son do? He decides that he's going to go back to Ukraine from New York City, where he was living, and he's going to save his parents and three sisters in Bella Cerca. But unfortunately, all of the Jews in Ukraine, they're trying to flee from Ukraine, and he's the only Jew trying to sneak into Ukraine. So we're going to kind of put this story aside because I have a fascinating story about actor Dustin Hoffman. Now, Dustin Hoffman's family does not appear in my book, but I did hear he was on Finding Your Roots maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I saw an old episode, and he wanted to learn about his Jewish roots. And his family was also from Bella Cerca. And his grandfather's story the beginning of the story is very similar to Barney's story. So his grandfather's name was Frank Hoffman, and he lived in Chicago with his wife and 4 children. They were originally, I guess, or at least Frank was originally from Bella Cerca. So one of the 4 children was Dustin's father. So anyway, he receives a letter right around the same time that Barney receives his letter. So I'm thinking, because I heard stories that there was no mail going on, they hadn't received any letters. And Barney received his letter from an American that had been passing through Bellitserka in 1920. And his father must have given this gentleman a letter to return to
Right.
his son when he came back to America. And I'm thinking maybe Frank Hoffman's father, who was living in Bellitserka, also may have found that same American, because both men each received a letter around the same time in America when there really wasn't any mail going on. So it's kind of an interesting parallel. And Frank receives a letter, "Come save us or we're all going to die." So Frank decides he's going to do, not knowing about Barney, but he's going to do the same thing. He's going to go back to Bellitserka and try to save his parents from the pogroms. So I did a little research, and it was in August of 1920. Both of these men went back to Ukraine. So Frank goes first, and he gets to Ukraine. He sneaks in. But what happens? Unfortunately, the Bolsheviks, their police, arrest Frank Hoffman, and unfortunately they executed him.
Oh,
Yeah. And then Frank Hoffman's father, now I think his name might have been Sam Hoffman, he goes looking for his son to find out what happened to his son. And the Bolsheviks grab him and they execute the great grandfather of Dustin Hoffman. Then Dustin's great grandmother goes looking for her husband and her son, and they threw her in prison. So that story ends very, very tragically. Dustin's father's family that remained in Chicago, the mother, the widow, now a widow, took the 4 children. I think they moved to California. I'm not sure. I guess that's how Dustin sort of ended up out there. It was very painful. I mean, the grandfather never came back. So let's go back to Barney's story. Barney gets on a ship around the same time. He goes back into Ukraine and he gets arrested. But there's something about Barney. There's this certain people help him. There's a certain charisma
yeah.
about him. He can talk his way out of anything, Sheila.
I read
And
it all. He escaped a million times, a
he
million
escaped a
different
million
things.
times.
Yeah.
There are so many wild stories about
Right.
Barney in my
Got to
book.
read the book. People have
Yes.
to read the book. Yeah.
So 2 of the soldiers help him. He was going to be executed, and they freed him and they put him on a train, and he ends up on foot. It's Yom Kippur evening in 1920. He's on foot and he's walking down the streets of Bellitserka, ready to save his family, and everybody runs out of the house. They ran out of that house, the one I showed you a picture of. That's where my grandmother was. And it's like Elijah the prophet, basically,
Right. Yeah.
arrived to save them. And he says
And
to his mother, the mother's out screaming. She sees him for the first time, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And he says to her, "I'm here to save you. I'm going to take you all to America." So what does his mother say, Sheila? The mother says, "Okay, but you're going to bring like 50 or 60 of our nearest and dearest friends with us." And
80.
that didn't seem to be enough, because Molly Cutler Stumacher says to her husband, they're the ones who own the big house, "Well, I'm not going to America unless if you bring my entire family, the
Right.
Cutler and Capro family." So that included my grandmother, Hannah. So
Right.
now poor Barney goes into Ukraine. He aims to save 5 people and he ends up with 80. And now he's in charge of getting them out of Ukraine. And,
Oh,
and
wow.
that's what Barney does. I mean, remarkable.
Amazing. A
2
caravan of 80 Stavisha Jews. And of
Yes, and
course,
he's
I
a
don't
young
know
man
when.
too. He's a man.
Yeah.
He's only about 26, I think, years old.
Fantastic.
So they're out on,
Fantastic.
well, not quite ready for the next one yet, but they're on the if we could go back to Barney's photo, if you're able to do that, they're making their way by horse and carriage, open carriages, to Romania. And where do we end up? We're back to the beginning of my story, the Dniester River. Barney
Right.
figured out the easiest way to cross. A lot of people from Stavish crossed where there were mountains. Barney figured out the flatlands. And so they went over. You know what happened with my grandmother's boat? It sank, of course, but
Right.
eventually they all made it over safely because of Barney Stumacher. I do want to say one thing before we do go on to the next picture. Before he received that letter from his father, asking for help to come save them, he led a very quiet and uneventful life. After he returned from Europe, he led a very quiet and uneventful life for the rest of his life. But that 1 year of his life between 1920 and 1921, this man was absolutely spectacular. I have never heard another story like it. And I am alive today and my descendants, my family, because of Barney Stumacher.
Yeah.
He
Well, that's
deserves to be
interesting.
remembered.
Absolutely. Fantastic story. And of course, I don't know who helped my mother and my grandmother and my aunt. Were they alone when the three of them left? Were they in a little caravan, not with Barney, but with someone else? I don't know. We know they came around the same time over the river and lived, and that's what lived in the Kishinev area, right? Probably where your
Yes.
family lived. But
Most of
how
the
they
Jews.
actually made it, who accompanied them on that perilous journey, the 200 or so miles from Stavisht over the river into Romania, it's a mystery to me. Maybe someday I'll find that out.
There must have been a group of people that they were with.
Right.
That's what I feel. I don't think they did it alone because it's very dangerous because bandits were always hiding in the woods, like on the way down. That's why they
Right.
went in
Right.
large groups.
Right. They must have been part of a different group. Well, maybe in your research or mine, we'll come across something more about it. We'll
Well,
figure it
I'm going to
out.
look. I'll
Okay.
certainly look. So we look now. This photograph is the Braga. That's the ship that brought my grandmother to America. So Barney's group went ahead to America. They had their passports and their visas. And as soon as it was a few months, they went through a lot of red tape and there were some stories about the passports, but they left. And my family was stranded. About 20 members of my closest family remained in Kishinev, probably like yours, Sheila. So now we're in 1923, and the same thing with your family because we know when they took the ship. So they're on the Braga. This is a picture postcard. Isaac Kaprov, my great grandfather, bought it, and you can see he scribbled his name in Russian across the front of the postcard. Lucky for me, he didn't have a stamp, Sheila, because I am now the proud recipient of this beautiful postcard.
Wonderful relic. Wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened with the ship? This is a very fascinating story. There were quotas coming into America. America had quotas now. You could only a certain amount of people could come over, and they broke it down in each month from different countries. And the best time of the month to come over was the first day of the month because that was the beginning of the new monthly quota. And once it's filled, you'd have to go back. So you don't want to come the last day of the month. So we have 4 ships. So now we're looking at the Byron. This ship, of course, Sheila, you know this ship very well. You want to speak a little bit about it?
Well, I learned about it by going on the website of the Ellis Island Museum, and I got a photograph of the Byron, and I got the manuscript, not the manuscript, the manifest, which is the list of passages on the ship, and we have a picture of that with my mother and my grandmother on that, and you had relatives of yours on that ship as well, even though your grandmother came in the Braga. You had relatives on this one as well.
Right. There are characters in my book who are real people. My grandmother's aunt and uncle, Yunkel, who was Jacob, and his wife Esther. And what happened was there are 4 ships. So they're on one ship. My grandmother's on another ship. There's 2 other ships. They're hovering around this imaginary line in the waters of Ellis Island. And they want to come in the first day of the month. It's August 31st, 1923. They're waiting for midnight to strike. And something happens. One of the 4 ships, not one of the 2 that ours was on, but one of the other ships crosses the imaginary line and all the ships follow. And what happens, the observer at Ellis Island says they came in, I think my grandmother's ship was 4 minutes before midnight and your mother's ship was 3 minutes before midnight. So they were clocked in on August 31st, which is the worst day of the month to be clocked in. We're looking at the passenger records. So up top, if you can read it, you'll see the first six
Cutler.
people. Cutler.
Cutler wife, Cutler son,
Right.
son, daughter, Cutler. That's your family.
So that's Jacob, who was Yunkel in my book. Esther, his wife, was Cantor David Yosel Moser's daughter. And then their 4 children, and 2 of the children were prominent characters in my book. Let's look at the very bottom, Sheila.
Here they are. Zivanitska, that's
Zivanetska.
Sora was my grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
and Zivanitska Chavid was my mother. Her name was really Yocheved, and the manifest, they had her listed as a boy, but she had this Buster Brown haircut.
They all had Buster Brown haircuts.
I know.
They did. So this is proof. This is my proof. I feel like my family knew your family. They're in line together, Sheila.
They must have.
They had to know each other. How amazing. I have like chills now just looking at this and talking to you about this, but they're all on the same ship, and they're all going. My grandmother's on the ship next to them. They're all going through the same thing. What happened was there was a lot of controversy because they came in the last day of the month, and by a couple of minutes, and their lives hung in the balance because they were across the New York Times on September 2nd, which was the next day. The headline read, over 1,800 aliens, they call them, may have to go back to Europe because they came into a few minutes too soon. The ships crossed over, and there were all kinds of discussions, and America, thank God, decided that the passengers could stay. So Sheila, this is our lucky story, our lucky genealogical moment. Our families were able to stay because if they sent us back, I don't think you and I would be here
Can you
today.
imagine if they were sent back? That would be unbelievable. And did you know in your research if any other families were able to were sent back? Do you know if any was sent back?
Not from these 4 ships, but I'm sure there were others that were sent back, and sometimes they were sent back for health reasons and things like that. So this is a picture, a passport photo. And I know, Sheila, you have a passport photo.
I have them too, right? Yeah.
It looks similar. And I think when we opened up the pages, we saw they were from they had the same handwriting on it. The same person probably processed their paperwork. This is my Capro family. So my grandmother, Hannah, is the girl in the back row. They're the oldest of the girls. Sunny, her sister, she's got the Buster Brown, like your mother, Buster Brown cut. That's her sister and her baby brother, her father, Isaac, and mother, Rebecca. So a cousin of mine said they looked rather terrified. They've been through the pogroms, and look, if you look at their faces, the only one smiling is the baby who really didn't know what was going on. But that's what she had said. I say this from Fiddler. Soon I'll be a stranger in a strange new place, searching for that old familiar face. So basically, I think the only silver lining is that even though they went through such horrible times, they survived the Holocaust.
Exactly. There's a family photo.
Yes, this is the Cutler and Capro families in America. So these are all the people that are in my book. This is the wedding of Bessie Cutler. Bessie was Rebecca's youngest sister, and she's my grandmother's aunt. So she's the beautiful woman in the middle back row there. But this was her second marriage. She lived in a small shtetl near Stavish, Sokolovka, Houstongrad, and her first husband was murdered during a pogrom there. They had a winter and a summer pogrom. She found him dead, face up in a wagon. There were 200 men were slaughtered by the river in her shtetl.
Wow.
And she had a baby girl, and the baby also died right afterwards. So this is her new life in America. And if we look all the way to the left, we'll see my grandmother. She's the oldest of the 3 children, and those are her brother and her sister. And this is about 1925 in New York.
Oh, there's your grandmother, Hannah.
That's my grandmother, Hannah, who became Anne. She was known as Anne in America. She looks a little bit older there because she's tall, but she's a teenager during the Roaring 20s. I absolutely love this photograph of her. But, times were hard for her. The first generations to come over made the most sacrifices. Her parents didn't learn English, so they had a hard time making a living. And so she had to go to work. She left
Right.
school at age 14. She was very bright. Her teachers begged her not to leave, but she decided she had to go to work because they really did need her to work to just for food on the table. So
Right.
she went to work in a garment factory, which a lot of the early immigrants did in the
They did.
1920s.
Yeah.
And but her sacrifices, I want to say this, she made quite a big sacrifice. She had to give up school at age 14, but because of her, our family 2 generations later has such a better life. We were able to become educated if we wanted to be. We have better jobs.
Right.
Our first ancestors are always the ones to make that sacrifice, and I thank her
They
for
were
that.
they were the pioneers. They were the
They were the
pioneers.
pioneers. This
And
is
then
Anne or Hannah again with her husband Ben, my
oh,
grandfather, taken at her
great.
sister Sonny's wedding. And I love this photograph, so I wanted to include it. She did suffer a lot, though. There's a repetitive theme in my book. She's claustrophobic because of what happened in the pogroms, and also, agoraphobic, running in the crowds. This is my wedding photo. My older
Yes,
son says I should
beautiful.
always end the talks with this photo because that's his opinion. I love it. It's my favorite photograph with my grandmother, taken 40 years ago.
Well, you look beautiful. Is it 40 years ago? You look
Yes.
beautiful today. You look
Thank
beautiful in that
you.
photo. And you
Yeah.
know what? We're going to talk to you more about genealogy, but we're going to do it on another program. And because it was said to you, you must end your wonderful program with this photo.
Oh,
We're going to end it with this wonderful photo also
okay.
and go back to just
So my son
chatting
got
our
his wish.
goodbyes. What?
My
Your
son
son
got
got
his
his wish
wish.
because we could go on forever, Lisa,
Yeah.
but you have so much to offer in the way of information about genealogy. And when you and I prepared this, we have another 20 slides that we can go into if we wanted to. But
Yeah.
this has been terrific, and I'm going to tell people I'm going to have another program with you that will delve more into the research, the genealogical tips that people can have, how we can find out more information, and we'll take some questions from people in advance that we can answer. So this has
Okay.
been terrific. Your book was a wonderful read. As I said, a combination of almost a fictional story come to life together with some true historical information, research, footnoting, and very, very important information
Yeah.
for everyone. Again, it resonates not just with people from Russia, from people all over the world
Yeah.
who have lived in perilous times, who flee their lands, who flee danger, and come to America, come to a place of refuge. So
The
it was
Golden
fabulous.
Land.
The golden in Medina, which
Golden
is
and
what the
Medina.
Jews
Correct.
said. So it was wonderful to meet you. We will continue our relationship. We will
Okay.
learn more about Stavish. You will tell me who helped my mother and my Bubby, my grandmother, over the Dniester
Well,
River. That's the
I'll tell you,
next chapter.
I'm running a search for your aunt. I've been
Okay,
looking.
fantastic. All
Okay.
right, everyone on Talkback. We'll see you next time. I hope you enjoyed our program with Lisa Brahin. Get the book, Tears Over Russia. See you
Okay.
next time.
Thank you,
Signing off.
Sheila.
Bye. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.